Let's see. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And today we have Joanne Schaffhausen back with us to talk about her brand new book, Long Gone. And Joanne signed a whole bunch of copies for us. And so if you'd like one, I'll go ahead and put a link in the comments field for you to purchase one. Also, if you have questions for Joanna, just go ahead and put them in, and Barbara will summon me back on screen towards the end of the hour. So Barbara, over to you.
I will do it. Thank you very much, Patrick. So we all had a copy. Briefly, we can all three hold up one. Come on, Joanne. See how it looks great. Great. So this is a new Annalisa Vega. And I particularly liked it because not only does it take place in Chicago, which is a city near which I grew up, but there actually is mention of Winnetka, my actual hometown. And you even coined a word. What was it? Winnetka. There's
Winnetka land. Yeah.
Winnetka land. That's it. So what you're basically saying is Chicago is the nucleus, but around it has grown an increasing hub of satellite cities and all. And when I was young, Winnetka was definitely a suburb. It went Evanston, Wilmette, Kenilworth, Winnetka, Glencoe, Highland Park. And we didn't think of ourselves as part of Chicago. We're distinctly the North Shore suburbs. But in those days, there was hardly anything out west. I mean, it was 4 freeways and all the rest of it. So if you wanted to drive what seemed to be bedroom communities today, if you wanted to go visit one, it was like a day trip. I mean, you packed a movie. You know, I mean, it's just so hard for me to think about, the greater Chicago area taking up as much space now as it does.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that the whole, I mean, there's Chicago proper, and even within Chicago itself is an enormous city where you can drive for, 45 minutes and still be in Chicago, technically. But like Chicagoland, when they talk about traffic in Chicagoland or weather in Chicagoland, even encompasses, like, I was surprised to learn this, part of Indiana is Chicagoland.
Well, yeah, because Gary, Indiana is actually not terribly far. If you driving down around the lake, if you make the bend there, with Chicago, you do wind up in Indiana. And when the steel mills were really going, when I was a kid, it was really interesting to drive because the mills, the whole sky was lit up with fire, especially at night. And if you were driving that, it was really dramatic.
Oh, that was it.
Yeah, no, it really was.
No, we know people who live in Indiana and commute to Chicago, so it can be done. But yeah, then it's kind of like New York, though. Like the people who actually live in the city boundaries consider themselves like the real Chicagoans, and then everybody else is the suburbs.
Well, but there are real neighborhoods, and Chicago is definitely a city of ethnic neighborhoods and immigrants. When I was young, Chicago was the largest Polish city in the world. I mean, it had just this huge number, and so very distinct neighborhoods. The South Side was completely different than the North Side. Michigan Avenue, the Miracle Mile, was completely different than I was allowed because there was it probably still is, a really great train service, the North Shore Railroad, and then there was the Northwestern. And my father, a businessman, commuted on the Northwestern because they had club cars, and they could smoke and all that other stuff. But the North Shore was kind of an electric train. And parenting was different then. I mean, I was like 10 years old, and, I could go on the North Shore and go down to Chicago, either go to Wrigley Field to a game or continue on down to Marshall Fields. And nobody thought anything of it, of us kids, running down to the city. And as long as we got to Marshall Fields, we could go anywhere. It was like the center of the compass.
Right, yeah.
And my whole concept of Chicago to this day still centers on Marshall Fields. I can get wherever I need to go as long as I can get to Marshall Fields. So you went that way towards the Art Institute and Symphony Hall. You went, back up over the river if you wanted to go towards other landmarks. Navy Pier was out there in the lake. Now they have tours of the Chicago River and all the rest of it, but that didn't exist then. Navy Pier was a little bit, actually, I think in the war, it was probably a real Navy pier.
Yeah, a real one. Yeah.
And then it's become more like kind of an amusement park, because Riverview, which was the great Chicago amusement park, I think now, I might be wrong, but I think it closed. You know, it was the one with all the roller coasters and all the midways and all the rest of it. And I think some of that translated over to Navy Pier, if I remember right, but I could be wrong. So anyway, Annalisa Vega, which is what, Italian?
Portuguese.
Portuguese. Okay, close.
Neighbor.
So this is her beat is, you know, Chicago, but is it really Chicago land or is it more narrow? I mean, you know, are the precincts fairly distinct? So she's in one precinct, she isn't wandering over to a different part of the city?
No, she's mostly in the sort of Wicker Park, more North Shore, kind of that area. They divide it up into different pieces, but obviously your case can take you to different parts depending on like where the witnesses are, where the suspects are. So she does get around, as you mentioned, into Winnetka in this case. But the police are supposed to live, like they in Boston, within the city. And so they do tend to live in a few different neighborhoods within Chicago. And in this story, one of the cops is gunned down in his bedroom of his pretty fancy house for a cop.
Yes.
And his much younger wife is amazingly unharmed. And she has a very wild story about what happened. And Annalisa has to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, I mean, it is an incredibly unlikely scenario, but you know, the North Shore suburbs were considered pretty posh compared to many neighborhoods in the city.
Yep.
So if you have a cop who has like a home, you know, somewhere like that, it automatically triggers off some questions about, you know,
Exactly.
right. And, you know, unfortunately, police corruption, I mean, Chicago was always kind of noted for, if not actual corruption, a whole, like a machine, you know, the political system was very much, you know, you couldn't be a plumber if you didn't have connections to get into the plumbers guild and get a plumber's license and all. So, you know, it was almost like the European guilds where, you know, if you wanted to do something that required licensing, you had to have an end to it.
Yeah.
And then people who mysteriously lived outside that on some sort of income were subject to question. So I guess one of the questions would be, in fact, it was when they go to find Leo, how can he live in a house like that? I mean, you described it at great length about the gorgeous floors and the beautiful paint job. And, you know, it's really a luxury home.
Yes, it is.
Ruined by the body and the blood, but, you know, there we are.
Yep, it's you know, more than $1 million home that he's living in, and the question is, where did he get that money? And he's part of a group of 4 cops that are nicknamed the Fantastic Four because they're always bringing in the big criminals, especially drugs and guns and stuff like that. And they've racked up a lot of busts, but they're also kind of shoot first, ask questions later types, and they have cost the city money in having to settle claims against the cops for damage that they've done. So maybe they're not necessarily so fantastic, but clearly somebody had a beef with this one because he ended up murdered in his own bedroom.
Yeah, so the obvious suspect would be his much younger second wife.
Yeah.
His first wife appears to have a great alibi. He had a couple of children.
Yeah.
And then he's got his 3 partners who are unhappy that Annalisa has drawn this case. So for those who haven't read the series, you might want to tell us why Annalisa is regarded with such anger by her fellow cops.
Well, so this is the second book in the series, and I never thought it could be a series because of the way the first book ends. And the first book is Gone for Good. And in that one, Annalisa makes a decision at the end that blows up her entire life, her relationship with her family, her relationship with all the cops, because she turns in her father, who's an ex-cop, for his role in a murder that he helped cover up. And so now the family is not pleased with her, and her cop family is not pleased with her, and she's kind of on the outs. So when it looks like Leo, this dead cop in this story, might be hiding some secrets behind the thin blue line, Annalise is all too happy to smash through it since she's already on the outs with everybody. She figures she has nothing to lose. But yeah, there's no way to hide the end of the first book in this one.
No, not at all. And it isn't just her father. It also involves her brother.
Yep, her brother too. Her whole family basically is pretty unhappy with her.
Right. And for
Yeah.
excellent reasons. What nudged you towards writing a sequel? Because I agree with you. When I read it, I thought it was a standalone because you were already writing a different series.
Yep. Yeah, I initially intended it as a standalone, but the publisher said, hey, let's make it a series. And I thought, okay, well, that sounds good. You know, more books. Annalise is a really fun character to write. She's partnered with her ex-husband, which is also a fun dynamic to write. So it was appealing, but I said, you know, there's going to be this tricky part where I have to spoil book one in the subsequent books because there's no way to pretend this thing with Annalisa didn't happen. And I wrote Gone for Good years ago, like 2018, and it didn't come out until last year. So back in 2018, when they said, let's make it a series and we'll figure it out later. And I said, okay. And then it came time to write it and I still hadn't figured it out. And I was like, oh, I'm going to have to spoil it. And at one point they're like, maybe we could give her amnesia. And I was like, nah, we all were like, nah, when you think about it, because part of the reason you want to follow Annalisa and have interest in her character is to see what happens after she blows up her whole life. You're like, well, okay, now what? And so in Long Gone, we see the now what. Well,
that's true. And you could certainly not conceal the reason why her fellow cops mistrust her. Also, why her husband, who was her partner, why they divorced. And, you know, that's part of the story too, is, you know, is he going to stay her partner? Is he going to transfer somewhere else? You know, they were married and it blew up and he has, like everybody else, had trouble with that. But, you know, here we are. So you've got, yeah, it cost her marriage, her family, you know, goodwill in the department, generally disastrous. So, but the right thing to do, right?
Yeah, I think she made the right choice. I do think it's interesting, you know, she went with the law over fellow cops and over her family. Like basically, if she had gone the other way, it would have meant keeping quiet about what she knew about a murder. And instead, she told the truth. And I'd say almost everybody, all my readers are like, no, she made a hard choice, but she made the right one. Except one reader who's like, man, Annalisa, I don't know why she did that. Snitches get stitches. Like, if she were my relative, I'd cut her dead. You know, like, woof.
Yeah, but that's the reason that people get away with stuff. That's the reason, you know, the corrupt cops are able to survive and thrive is that, you know, there's that. I mean, it's the reason, you know, back in my legal background, it's really hard to try a doctor for malpractice because the other doctors don't want to, you know, testify against them. And they think, well, you know, it could be me. And so there's this kind of wall that goes up. It's also true with lawyers that, you know, are sued for malpractice or whatever. There's a kind of, you know, bringing everybody into the tent.
Yeah.
You know, and protecting it. But the problem is that the corruption, whatever the problem is then, you know, is sort of sanctioned and it continues.
Yeah.
And it oftentimes leads to other crimes. I mean, at some point, it's like lancing a boil, you know, you have to deal with it. And I think that's what Annalisa's decision was, is the guilt of the cover-up and the corruption of the cover-up was worse for her than the fallout of actually, you know, outing the whole thing. So, I think you put her in an interesting predicament. And yeah, she's a tough cookie character.
She definitely is. Yeah.
Right. So how does she differ, when you're writing your other series, which is set in Boston? Well, let me ask this. Why Chicago? How do you know much about Chicago? You should tell us that first.
I initially wrote the book to be set in Boston, and my publisher said we should move it because your other series is set in Boston with a female cop. So we want to differentiate the two. And so I thought about places I could move it. And I needed, for the first book, especially, someplace big enough to hide a serial killer, someplace with generations of people who lived basically still in the same neighborhood. And a place that I had been enough that I felt like I could write it. And I've been to Chicago a whole bunch. I love the city. And so I felt like I at least had a grasp of the geography and some of the history. And then I also brought on some really helpful beta readers who live in Chicago or have lived in Chicago, grew up there, who could help me get the details right. And so the series moved to Chicago, which it's funny because my other character, Ellery, was born in Chicago. So she had, again, because I had a decent knowledge of Chicago going in, I made Ellery from Chicago and having moved to Boston. So the other series does occasionally reference Chicago as well. I figure maybe one day they could meet, Ellery and Annalisa, they could meet up in Chicago, have a dog.
Sure.
Sure.
I think Chicago is really underserved by the mystery community. I've had this conversation. There are very few mystery writers, actually. I mean, considering that it is, or, when I was young, the second biggest city, but now it might be the third, but whatever. It's one of the top 5, let's put it that way, cities in the United States. It's the hub. I mean, for a long time, it was the railroad hub, it was the airline hub, it's the meatpacking hub. It's at the bottom of the Great Lakes. So, tons of shipping and the whole bit. I mean, it's a really huge and important city with lots going on and a high crime rate, not a fictional one, but an actual high crime rate. And so it makes me wonder why there are so few people who write about it.
I would expect more as well, but it seems like LA and New York are the big ones.
Yeah, well, New York, in part because publishing is located in New York and people who write books are often involved in publishing and the whole bit. And it's kind of like the universal American city. And Los Angeles, I think a lot of it is the glamour of the movies and the celebrity and the fact that when crime fiction really took off in the early 20th century, Chandler, and so, they lived there. Hammett was in San Francisco, but California was a place where the frontier ended and the Western kind of morphed into the private eye novel and all. So, it makes a certain amount of sense. But I'm just always, it's hard to write a lot of crime novels about Washington because it's so political. I think that, people don't really associate, but there are lots of cities that really deserve, more writers.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have a lot in Phoenix that are writing about Phoenix or Scottsdale. It's, Albuquerque, Richmond, Virginia. I mean, Atlanta has Savannah. It's just interesting. For a long time, Boston, the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, Seattle, New York, Los Angeles, the bulk of New Orleans for a long time was a huge magnet for mystery writers, and not quite so much at the moment. I don't know if Katrina and all the problems that have been associated with New Orleans, and maybe there's a lot more racial sensitivity now, and New Orleans is a tough thing to write about. But Chicago has an enormous Black population, an enormous immigrant population, so. Plenty to write about there. I mean, there were terrible, the 1968 riots, there were a tremendous racial component to that.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I'm glad you're writing about it, and it'd be fun for you to visit. You yourself live in Boston now?
Yeah, I live outside of Boston.
Right. So what brought you into writing mysteries?
Oh gosh, I just always have liked writing mysteries since I was a kid. My third grade teacher had us do a weekly creative writing assignment where she would provide the first sentence of a story and we had to take it from there. Like I went up to my parents' attic and you'll never guess what I found. And I knew I was a writer because other kids would write like 4 lines, like this much on the page. And I just write page after page after page. And I like to write mysteries. And I would sometimes write the solution to the mystery upside down so the teacher could like try to figure it out and then like turn the paper over to see if she'd gotten it right. I'm sure they were really hard to solve because I was 8 and I was modeling off of Scooby-Doo. But this was what I liked, right? I liked Nancy Drew and Encyclopedia Brown. And so I wrote the stories that I liked. But I knew even back then, like my teacher, we'd have to write it on the crappy brown paper first, and then she would correct our spelling and grammar, and we would have to rewrite it on the nice white paper with the correct spelling and grammar. So this meant I would have to handwrite whatever I wrote again. So I was punishing myself by writing these really long stories because the other kids would be off at recess and I'd be there laboriously copying my mystery into the nice paper. But I loved it that much, even at 8 years old, that I was willing to sacrifice recess time so that I could write my stories.
Well,
and I think that's kind of what a writer is.
No kidding. That is commitment. At the same time, though, what a really good thing, because you were honing your skills even at this young age. Do you still write anything? I mean, there are plenty of writers today who still write first drafts by hand and then, step over to the keyboard.
Yeah, I don't know how they do it, man. I switched to computer probably about age 15 or 16 and never looked back. Like I'll write notes sometimes.
Yeah.
Handwritten, but for the draft, like I need to be able to type to keep up with my brain. My poor hand can't. So I admire those people who can write an entire novel out longhand, but I have to type.
Well, I couldn't do it either. Actually, my eyes go so fast and my handwriting is terrible, because my hand can't keep up with all the rest of it.
It's
So
hard, right?
I've always had terrible handwriting. And the other thing I really love about being able to do electronic composing and also move stuff around.
Yeah.
And, I think that's a real gift, but people write by hand, I think they feel like, they're forced to be logical and, it kills the digressions. But the truth is, people always ask this question. So that's why I was bringing it up, what's your writing process and how do you do it? I think whatever works for you.
Oh yeah.
Any individual writer is the right process. So
whatever the words on the page. Yeah.
Right. So if you're writing a police procedural, it's relatively logical in the progression and it generally moves forward. I mean, you do have to go back. In fact, you have backstory in here that you can't avoid discussing or we won't know what's going on with Annalisa. But the momentum of the investigation, unless you're doing cold case books or something, I talked to Robert Dugoni about that yesterday because his new police procedural with Tracy Crosswhite is a cold case. But I like, my mind works that way. And, I really like that learning as we go, the revelations as they go and so forth. So basically, when you're writing your books, we know about what Annalisa knows, but do you know more than Annalisa or do you discover it as you're writing?
I know more than Annalisa because I know how it ends.
Oh,
and she doesn't yet.
No.
Especially in Long Gone, that one, it's got a different structure than some of my other books because you get the cop's point of view and right at the prologue, they're up to no good. And there's some sort of inciting incident that is happening there that Annalisa doesn't know about, but we, the reader, know about. And so part of the book is watching her get closer and closer to figuring out what was going on in those opening pages and why it's causing all those reverberations that it is.
So is Annalisa the point of view character, or do you give other people page time?
She gets the lion's share, but other people also get point of view. And in particular, the cops, the Fantastic Four. Leo's dead pretty much at the outset, but there's 3 others. And so they are scrambling around trying to figure out what it means that Leo got murdered and what to do about it, especially because they don't like Annalisa investigating and they're worried about what she might find. So they have a point of view as well. And a few other characters get to weigh in occasionally.
I think it'd be hard to write a police investigation entirely in one person's point of view. I mean, by its nature, a police investigation generally anyway involves more than one person. I mean, it's more of a team effort.
Yeah.
So she can't really, I mean, a private eye, it can be just the private eye all the way through. It doesn't have to have any teamwork and can be a single point of view. But I think it's very hard. Did you ever read the 87th Precinct books that, you know?
I love them. Yeah.
Yeah. And part of it, you know, was there was more than one case going on and, you know, people working things and helping each other and so forth. And I think to be realistic, Adele Shannon, one of my mother's all-time favorite authors, also wrote, as Elizabeth Lynington, wrote police procedurals in the 50s set in the LAPD with Lieutenant Luis Mendoza as the lead. And what was realistic about those was A, there was more than one point of view, but B, there were always 2 or 3 cases going on in the book. There'd be like a central case that, you know, at some point towards the end would have to be resolved. But the cops were also working other cases, most of them minor in comparison to whatever the central. I mean, I remember there was one where somebody was stabbed like in the very beginning, and all the way through the book, it seemed impossible to solve it. There was no witness, there was no weapon, you know, nobody was ever going to get the person who did the stabbing. And there were various cases going on, but then somehow, can you remember how at the end, something came along that, you know, let them solve that case. But it was like a real police department, how it worked.
Yeah.
So in this, even though the Fantastic Four are the central focus, do you have other sidebar investigations, even as small ones, going on?
Yes. Sometimes it takes me a minute to remember which is which.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Because the next book requires Annalisa to solve 5 cases. And that's dead and gone. And so I've finished writing that one. And so there's 5 separate cases in that one that she has to figure out to get to the answer. But this one, when she's trying to figure out who killed Leo,
Right.
The cop, she finds out that he'd recently had a run-in with a guy named Mo, who Leo had suspected Mo strangled his girlfriend like a couple decades ago and got away with it. And so Leo was mad that Mo got away with it. And so they had like a fight in a bar about it. And so when Leo turns up dead, because Leo had vowed to take another look at the case, that maybe Mo killed him and that he's the guy that broke into Leo's house and shot him in his bedroom. And so Annalisa starts looking at Mo, who's like a rich kid, who's now an adult, like a middle-aged man. He was kind of a college-age kid, or at the time the girlfriend was murdered. And his dad was a really wealthy used car salesman in the area. And so Mo was always used to getting what he wanted, and the girl broke up with him. Her name was Josie. And when Josie dumped him, he kind of went a little crazy. And so the cops thought he killed her when she dumped him. And now it's, 15, 20 years later, he's gone on with his life. And one of the ways he's gone on with his life is he's now dating Annalisa's best friend. And so this is somebody who maybe murdered another girlfriend. So Annalisa is like, you really got to stop seeing him. And her best friend does not welcome Annalisa meddling. But so she now has two cases to solve. She's got this cold case of the murdered girlfriend, and did Mo kill his girlfriend all those years ago, like Leo thought? And did he also then kill Leo to prevent the truth coming out? Or did somebody else kill Leo for other reasons? And if Mo didn't kill Josie, who did?
Well, yeah. And part of that then is that even if Leo were corrupt, if he is corrupt, or, he and his bar, they still are enough cops that they, enough of a cop that they want to solve crimes. So being a corrupt cop doesn't mean that you don't do your job all the time. It means you take advantage of whatever opportunity may come along, generally for personal enrichment. But, there are cases of cops, harassing women who've dumped them, or, having some sort of vendetta on the side, or, it is a position of power.
Yep.
And, and it's easy to abuse it. So, but
I was saying, like, I talk to cops and I research cops and stuff for my both series, and I put in all kinds of stuff, like the good stuff that cops do and the hard cases that they crack, and sometimes like funny stuff, like all the little cop stories that I put in there are true things that happen. Like there's one where the cop gets called out and the woman is complaining that the cicadas are making too much noise in the trees, and she wants him to do something about it. And he's like, I don't have 1,000 tiny handcuffs. Like, what do you want me to do about the cicadas? I can't, I'm a cop. I can't arrest the bugs in the trees. And another time, this guy's wandering around yelling, help, help, help. And so the cop comes over and it's like, what do you need help? And it turns out he's looking for his cat, who's named Help.
Oh, okay. It's not that unusual for cops and firemen to be rescuing pets, particularly cats, because they climb. Dogs don't climb; they do other dumb stuff. But then you also have, maybe it's in Bob. Unfortunately, I read your book and Bob's back to back, so now I'm trying to remember. I think it was in Bob's book. There was a retired cop named Moss, and a question there was he crooked, or was he just lazy? Was he a guy that just put in his time and, didn't necessarily throw a case so much as just didn't make the effort to work it. So, but that's a different thing than actual corruption. So I'm pretty sure it was in the Tracy Crosswhite, now that I think about it. Yeah. I have the same trouble you do. It's hard for me to keep the book straight.
So when people ask me, like, how's the book going? I'm like, do you mean the one that just came out, the one that's coming out, the one I'm actually writing? Like,
right. I know it's hard for readers to understand, because the immediacy is this book, right? It just has arrived. Right. But in the nature of publishing, you're 2 books ahead because you have already completed another book. Well, in your case, since you're doing 2 series, even more than that probably. But let's just say there was a third for Annalisa.
Yep.
Is either you're already working on it, you're conceived of it, or you've actually finished it and then you've moved on to something else. Do you see yourself doing something different other than police novels? I mean, I think they're fun to write, and I'm not trying to encourage you to branch out, but are you thinking about maybe something, or will it just lead to a 3rd series and then you'll really be tired?
Yeah, no, I'm kicking around other ideas all the time, and some of them don't really fit police procedurals. So it's totally possible I may publish something else down the line. But next after this one is definitely Annalisa 3.
Okay, and then are you going back to your other one?
Nope, the other series is done. At least for now. Yep.
Oh.
Ellery series finished with Last Seen Alive that came out in January of this year.
Right, which I liked a lot. We talked about it then.
Thank you. I like it too.
Yep. Well, sometimes it's good to give them a rest. It doesn't mean they're dead and gone forever, unless you've
No.
actually killed them.
I didn't kill anybody important. So, there could be theoretically more Ellerys and Reeds in the future, but for the moment, they're in a good place.
That was an interesting relationship. Maybe you had done as much with it as you reasonably could for a while.
Yeah, I mean, there are different monkey wrenches you could throw into that. Like they both have issues still and surrounding people in their orbits that could give them trouble, but it left them in a good place and left them alive. So if we never heard from them again, it would be okay. But
they're out there leading their best lives, right?
Exactly, with Bump the Basset Hound.
Yeah. Well, it's true that publishers sometimes think that it's time to call it into a series and do something different. And if you're a professional writer, you have to go along with that. You can't just write whatever you feel like. But I like Ellery and Reed, so I'll hope that maybe at some point we'll see them. But meantime, Annalisa and Nick, and we haven't really talked about Nick. Tell us a little bit more about Nick. Nick is her ex-husband and
partner. Yeah.
Yep.
He's from Florida. And his dad murdered his mother and then committed suicide. So Nick was raised by his grandmother, actually, with a fair amount of trauma that led him to be like a people pleaser. And he's very charming. And he'll say whatever makes the person in front of him happy at that moment. He's very good at talking. He's a good talker. And he had a quickie marriage to Annalisa when they were quite young, and it didn't last very long, only a couple of years, partially because she married him somewhat out of desperation when her plan A didn't work out. This is covered in Gone for Good. And she made Nick plan B. And Nick, he didn't really have a plan other than to, bed whichever woman was coming along. And so he was not faithful to Annalisa at the time. And so they broke up. And then it's now, years later, more than 10 years later. And he's worked a lot on himself. And he says that he is reformed. He's worked through some of his issues. And he would like to be back in Annalisa's life as more than her partner. But she's not sure she trusts him.
Right. So, it makes some interesting characters to write, but, do you think they're just, comps who are just sort of regular guys and they think it would be an interesting profession and they don't have tragic back lives or whatever it is, and they go
that's probably most of them. Yeah.
You kind of, like to think that. I mean, especially with people, again, with that much power and so forth. You'd like them to be pretty squared away and not having to deal with parental suicides or tragic foster home upbringings or, other kinds of things. But, to make your in fiction more interesting, oftentimes you want to give them terrible stories.
Some law enforcement officers are drawn to the fix-it idea of, so maybe they did have a chaotic childhood. And they want to, help the world be a better place, maybe catch bad guys who were maybe bad to them when they were small. And so this is definitely not everybody, but I do think there are some people who get into the profession for that reason.
Oh, I think that's true. I think that may be true of the clergy. It may be true of, there was Bob's book that I was talking about earlier. There's a reporter who became a reporter because her mother, who was an investigative reporter, disappeared and has never been found. And she became a reporter to have access to information in order to, so you're right. There are plenty of reasons why people, may go into particularly if it's a profession where they can learn something, or have access to information as opposed to, becoming a manicurist or a bookseller for that matter, see what might happen. Anyway, I like Annalisa a lot, so I'm glad you're continuing with her. So will you just have one new book out next year then, not two?
Just one.
Are you happy with that? Sort of slowing down a bit?
I mean, keep writing. So I have other completed manuscripts and we'll see what happens to them.
Oh, okay.
But I just keep telling stories as I have time. 2 books a year is probably my limit.
Okay.
I could do more than that.
That's a lot.
I do write pretty quickly. Like it's generally, I spend some time thinking about the book. And then when I start writing, it's 12 weeks from page 1 to 100,000 words later.
That is fast. Good heavens.
Yeah, it's
What
about 50 days.
Are you writing full time or do you have another job?
Nope. I'm a full-time writer, which is the only way I can really do that. And then I take time off. I'm not one of these write every day kind of people, but when I'm writing, I'm writing.
Yeah.
And I don't really think about anything else. I don't read other books. I might watch a little TV with my husband, but for the most part, I'm writing the book. And so I'll be catching up with an old friend or something, and she'll say, "Well, so what's new?" And I'm like, "Well, I just have this book." And that's what else is new? And I'm like, "No, there's really nothing. It's this book." Takes up all my waking hours, thinking about it, writing it, whatever. But then after the 12 weeks, I'm, there, I leave it for a little while and then I edit it. And then, I'm done. So I can fit about 2 of those chunks in because they're pretty intense. I can do 2 a year with time off for recharging, editing, thinking about what the next one's going to be, that sort of thing.
Good for you. Is your husband a supportive husband? Because being a writer could be a little hard on the partner.
Yeah, he is. My favorite story about my husband and being married to a crime writer is I watch Forensic Files, go to bed at night. I have them all pretty much memorized. And we were watching them one evening, and it was about a wannabe mystery author who had murdered her husband. And the cops were suspicious when they showed up and there's the man dead on the floor, and they looked at her bookshelves and they were all about murder. Like Writer's Guide to Murder, Poisons 101, How to Kill People, Forensics You Need to Know, and just all of them. So the show is like panning across her bookshelves, showing all these titles. And my husband and I are lying there, and he turns to me, he says, "You have every one of those."
Made you nervous, huh?
Yeah, it's true, I do. But no, he's been wonderfully supportive the entire time. He's always believed in me way more, like all my friends and family have. So I have a weird how I got published story. Like I won the St. Martin's Minotaur first crime novel award with the Mr.
First crime novel, right?
Yeah, that was The Vanishing Season, and I won 2016. And I had a bunch of people who helped me get that manuscript in shape, and I sent it off to the contest, and they were all just sure I was going to win. I was like, "No, you don't understand. Hundreds of people enter this contest every year. There's like 500 people, and they only pick one. These are not good odds. That's less than 1%. So they only have to like one other book more than mine." So it was very funny when I got the wonderful call saying that I had won for that year. And I went and I told my friends, and they are all like, "Oh yeah, that's great. But we knew you were going to win."
Wow.
They weren't surprised. They're like, "We just knew it." And I'm like, "Well, that's very nice. I didn't know."
That's a fabulous vote of confidence. I really like
Yeah,
that.
I guess they were all just very certain, but not me. I was shocked.
Well, let's call Patrick up and see if he's shocked or if he has any questions that he might like to ask.
Always happy to see Patrick. Hey, Patrick.
Hi, not shocked. Let's see here. There are a few questions that have come in. Linda, and these are some kind of basic questions that you've touched on a little bit, but she asks, how do you create and develop your characters and your settings? And then she also asks, do you ever create a character but stop because someone, presumably someone resembles him or her too much?
Oh, do you write about people you know? Yes and no. Like sometimes somebody will say something funny or weird or something, and I make a little note of it, like, got to put that in a book sometime. Somewhere in my notes, a friend's young daughter, like we have daughters who are the same age, and a couple of years ago when they're like elementary school age, they adopted a female dog. And at some point they were talking and came up that like female dogs are called bitches. And the girl was convinced, like, this is a bad word. And she's like, they are not, that she just couldn't imagine their sweet dog, somebody calling it like the B word. And she's like, no, they're not. And they're like, no, really, that is the term. Like that's the official term for a female dog. And so then the parents are talking and they're like, what is a male dog called? Is there a term for a male dog? And the little girl goes, assholes? Like, and I just thought that was hilarious. I'm like, I
had to use that, right?
Right. I haven't yet, but it's in my notes of like sometime that's going in a book. Like, what do they call the male dog? But I don't model necessarily like a whole person. So like in the first series with Reed and Ellery, Reed has a young daughter, and some of the stuff she says and does are things my daughter said and did at that age. But like, overall, she's not my daughter. She's her own person. She's a different character. And as to how you create characters and settings, it's generally like you layer it in, right? Like it's like you're making lasagna. So you have an idea of what they look like, or where the mystery is taking place. And then, you write a little bit more. And so now you know a little more about the character beyond what they look like and what their name is. But like, maybe they're irritated by tomatoes. They just don't like tomatoes. They don't like looking at them. And you don't find this out until they're confronted with a tomato. So you just sort of get to know them as you go along. And, that helps with the reading too. Like you wouldn't want to open a book and have just a massive character description right at the beginning. It's like when you meet somebody, you know a little bit about them, and then you know them a little longer, so you know a little bit more. So you don't have to figure it out all on page one. In fact, it's good if you don't.
Yeah, you got to earn your reader's attention.
Right.
If they're bombarded with all this stuff that, question about just getting police and sort of cop culture down. That's got to be challenging, because there's so much subtlety and nuance that anybody in law enforcement who reads your book, may have that insider knowledge. And it seems to me from hearing people talk that it's all in those very tiny details. Do you have somebody who can vet your work for that kind of stuff?
I'm sure if I wanted to, I could find people. I have known cops. I do known cops, but I don't care. Sorry, right. Cops. I don't care. This is the thing. Like I have had law enforcement people write me to say like how authentic and real and everything the books are. And then I'm sure there's other stuff that I get completely wrong, but fiction by its own. I remember once being at a Sisters in Crime banquet, and we had a guest speaker come in who was in law enforcement, and he gave us like 20 minutes on how we all get jurisdiction wrong. Like who has what control of what at the crime scene and who's in charge. And he's like, you're just all wrong. And I'm sitting there listening to him and I'm like, oh, I totally believe that it's all wrong. Readers do not care. Like if you can make them care by giving them like a conflict between two people at different agencies, and like if you give them a reason why they care other than like, no, the body's on this side of the street, so it's mine or whatever, then they're not going to care. But for the most part, they don't care. Readers don't care about whether like the tiny details, unless it's a gun. Then they care a lot.
That's right.
Then they deeply, deeply care. My favorite is a story by a male crime writer who had, I'm going to blow the details because I'm not a gun person, but it was some sort of gun that had a safety. And so he had a scene where the guy was going in and he undid the safety on the gun in the scene. And then later, the writer was talking to a law enforcement person who told him that he had the wrong gun, that people in Colorado, like cops didn't carry this gun, or whichever, Colorado Bureau of Investigation. I don't remember what the law enforcement people, but the gun was wrong. And so he did a find and replace on the gun, and he changed it to be the correct type of gun. But he missed the part about the safety.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So now he had a guy in law enforcement removing a safety on a gun that doesn't have a safety. And nobody picked this up. And so it went to publication, and he got bombarded.
I'm sure.
People. My favorite bit was he was doing an appearance, and a woman came and stood up and called him out on this about the safety because her husband sent her. He meant to come, but he got sick. And he cared so much that the guy got this wrong in his book that he sent his wife to the event in his place to register the problem in the scene. So this is why, for the most part, my cops just carried guns.
A gun, right.
Annalisa took out her gun. Like, it's just a gun.
So you try to get as close as you can, but you don't sweat it, the real tiny stuff. I gotcha.
Yeah, I try to get as realistic as I can, but they're going to be not realistic just from the get-go. Like Barbara and I were talking about this before. Real police investigations typically involve a lot of people, especially if there's forensics, and it's like it's not one detective who follows the whole case all the way through, especially it's something big like a serial killer. You're multiple law enforcement agencies, many different people. And so that's not how fiction works. Fiction is generally filtered through one, maybe two protagonists. So you're already telescoping a lot of the investigation down. So then like if the DNA results come back in 24 hours, well, honestly, like people actually expect that now because the TV has conditioned them, like crime shows on TV where they get the DNA results back the same day. Like they now think it takes people who actually work in the industry to be able to say, no, that's still not how it works. Because the general public thinks it is how it works because that's how it works on TV.
It is amazing, though, how technology has changed the game so rapidly in such a short period of time. And, how every square, I can't remember who we were talking to, Barbara, but it was, I was talking about how I was watching the show First 48, which I think is a wonderful show, documentary, but it was like 2009. And even back then, a lot of the crime scenes, they didn't have security cameras everywhere the way they do now. I mean, there were some, but now it's like every square foot of a city street is under camera. And in that respect, it's really changed.
Yeah. And yet people still get away with murder.
They do. Yeah.
They do, right? It's not just the cameras, it's, the cell phones and geopositioning and all kinds of things. And, no communication is private if it's electronic. They can go back and get your phone records. And even if they can't find out what you said, they know who called you.
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing it seems to me that any criminal ought to work out is that they're going off on some criminal enterprise. They should leave their phone at home.
I cannot believe they still make this mistake, but they do. Our phones get them every single time.
Nope, you need a burner phone or basically no phone.
I just watched a thing recently about a guy who murdered his wife, and he did know enough not to bring his phone. He shut off his phone. He left it at home, but then he went and bought a burner phone with his credit card.
So they could identify.
Well, yeah, then they could use the credit card to connect him to this burner phone, and then they just trace that one. So.
And don't post about it on Facebook later. People.
Right? Like, don't go post about it.
And a lot of people do.
I know.
It's amazing how many people convict themselves anymore through their own social media.
Yep.
Astonishing. Right. Any other questions, Patrick?
Let's see. Linda says, I like British cop shows where all interviews are taped. I can't believe US cops don't tape all the interviews. I think they're supposed to.
They usually do. And
they're video recorded. It isn't just taping, but excuse me, I think they actually record them with video now.
Yep. They are supposed to be recorded.
Yeah. And they're supposed to note when people leave the room or come into the room and timestamp them and the whole bit. Yeah. I mean, the whole he said, she said thing was never productive. And so if you have it, if you have a record of it, it makes it different.
Yeah, I like the difference on television, where indeed they're frequently not recorded on TV in American cop shows, even now.
Yeah.
But like if you watch, because a lot of the true crime will show you these outtakes from the cops interviewing people, they'll use that footage as part of the true crime documentary or whatever. And you can see like where these interviews actually take place. And they are like in what looks like a sad little office, usually, like no windows, cement blocks, little desk, and fluorescent lighting, some rolling chairs. And then you see television's version, and there's always like the two-way mirror, and it's really dark with just like a single bulb overhead. And it amuses me, the difference between what it actually looks like and how we portray it on television.
Right.
Storytelling is different on television. I mean, it just is a different medium.
Yeah. No, you got to make it visually interesting, and a little beige square box is not interesting.
Not very interesting. Very true.
Yep.
I
think that's about it for the questions.
All right. Well, Joanna, it's really wonderful to talk to you again. I think The Long Game Long Gone is a wonderful book. I was really pleased to see Annalisa return because, as we said earlier, it didn't seem possible that there would be a sequel, but with all the things that have happened in her life, you really did want to know more about her. So I'm glad that we get to do that. When is Dead and Gone coming out next year?
Next August. Yep.
Great. All right. Well, I will look forward to that, and you should too. Meantime, we have autographed copies of Long Gone. So if you'd like to get one, grab one while we still do. Thank you very much. Great to see you.
Likewise.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.